Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Western Tales. Today, I want to share with you a story about mercy, loss, and the kind of courage that only grows in the coldest parts of the world. It's the story of a man named Elias Rowe, a widowed rancher who learned that sometimes salvation doesn't ride in on a clear day. It comes through a storm. The winter of 1887 was the kind of winter folk still whisper about in Montana. A whiteout blizzard had rolled in from the mountains and swallowed everything alive. The wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the earth, erasing fences, trees, even the sky itself. Somewhere in that white chaos, a horseman fought his way home. His name was Elias Rowe 45. Broad-shouldered, quiet. A man who didn't say much, but carried whole sermons in the lines on his face. He'd buried his wife 4 winters back, raised 2 children since then, and learned that silence is a kind of company when grief won't let go. That evening, the snow came down sideways, thick as wool, cutting the world to ribbons. Elias leaned forward in the saddle, trusting his horse more than his eyes. The animal's name was Juniper, a chestnut mare with more sense than most men. Each step sank deep into the drifts, and each breath came out white and ragged. Home was still 3 miles away, and in weather like that, 3 miles could mean the difference between seeing your children again or never being found at all. He muttered through frozen lips, "Come on, girl, just a little further." But the horse stopped. Her ears pricked forward, body tense, nostrils flaring. Something ahead. Elias squinted through the storm, saw nothing but the swirling white. Then, faintly, a darker shape half buried in snow. At first, he thought it was a fallen branch, maybe a log caught in the drift. But as he came closer, he saw the edges delicate, lace-like, wrong for any timber he knew. He dropped to his knees, brushed away the snow with gloved hands, and froze. It was a woman in a wedding dress. The fabric was stiff as bark, frozen solid. But the faint shimmer of satin still clung beneath the frost. Her lips were blue, her skin white as marble. For a long second, Elias thought she was already gone, but then just barely he felt it. A breath, faint and shallow. She was alive. He looked around. No wagon, no tracks, no sign of anyone else. It made no sense how she'd gotten there, where she'd come from, he whispered, half in prayer, half in disbelief. "Lord have mercy, not out here." Elias lifted her in his arms, her body stiff as a plank, the frozen lace cracking beneath his hands. He laid her across the saddle, climbed up behind, and turned toward home. The horse needed no urging, now she knew the way. Snow blinded him, but a man like Elias didn't need to see to find his way back. He rode by instinct, by the memory of every fence post and every tree line that led home. At last, a faint orange glow flickered through the white, a lantern in the window of his cabin. Home. He kicked the door open, snow spilling in after him. Inside, warmth, firelight, and 2 small faces staring wide-eyed from the hearth. His son, Ben, 10 years old, sturdy and steady like his father, and Clara, 7, small and bright as a spark, her mother's spirit shining through her eyes. Papa Ben said, rising to his feet, "You're late." Elias carried the woman straight to the fire, voice rough from cold. "Blankets. Quick." Hot water. Clara ran, her little feet pattering on the wood floor. Ben grabbed the wool throws from the chest by the wall. They worked fast. No questions. Yet, Elias stripped off his gloves, his hands trembling as he peeled away the frozen fabric from the stranger's body. Her skin was cold as death. But beneath the frost, a pulse still fluttered, weak and stubborn. He wrapped her tight in blankets, rubbed her arms and hands to stir the blood. Her eyelids twitched once. A small, broken sound escaped her lips. "She's breathing," Clara whispered. "Papa, is she an angel?" Elias looked down, his face lit by the fire's glow. He rubbed the frost from his beard and said quietly, "Angels don't freeze. Sweetheart, she's just lost." For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of fire and the storm battering the cabin walls. Elias sat beside the woman, watching her breathe, half afraid she might stop, half afraid she might not. He hadn't carried a woman through his door in 4 years, not since the night his wife died bringing Clara into the world. The memory still hurt like a fresh wound. And now, here he was again, holding another woman between life and death, with no idea who she was or what ghosts rode with her. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees. Inside, warmth began to return to the cabin. Clara dozed in a chair, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Ben kept the fire fed, serious beyond his years. Elias checked the woman again. Color had started to creep back into her cheeks, faint pink beneath the pallor. He sighed, sat back, and stared into the flames. His mind wandered the way it does when the body's too tired to argue. Who leaves a woman out there in a storm like that, and in a wedding dress? No less. He thought about the old miners saying, "Out here, trouble finds you. Or you find it, but you never leave it breathing in the snow." Maybe tonight he'd found his share. Or maybe, just maybe, mercy had finally come knocking again. Hours passed. The blizzard eased its rage, settling into a softer whisper. Elias dozed in his chair. Then, faintly, he heard movement, the rustle of blankets. A gasp. He opened his eyes. The woman was awake. Her eyes gray, clear as ice water, were wide with confusion. "Easy," he said softly, lifting his hands in peace. "You're safe." She tried to speak, voice raw. Safe, the word sounded foreign in her mouth, like she didn't quite believe in it anymore. "You're in my cabin," he told her. "Near Hollow Creek. Found you in the snow." She looked down, saw that her dress was gone, replaced by a man's flannel shirt and wool blankets. Panic flashed in her eyes. "I have to leave," she whispered. Now, Elias shook his head. Storms still raging. "You'd die in 10 minutes. She turned her face toward the window, where the wind still clawed at the glass. He could see the fear in her, the kind that runs deeper than cold. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Margaret," she said finally. "Margaret Hale." He nodded once. "Elias Rowe. Those are my children, Ben and Clara, from the loft above." Clara's sleepy voice called down, "Hi, Miss Margaret." The woman blinked up, surprised, a faint tremor of a smile forming on her lips. "Hello there," she whispered, and for the first time since the storm began, something warm flickered in that cold little cabin, something beyond the fire. By dawn, the snow outside lay quiet and heavy. The storm had passed, but its silence carried weight. Elias stood at the door, watching the pale light creep over the valley. Behind him, Margaret slept by the fire, her breathing even, her hands no longer blue. He didn't know her story, didn't know what devils chased her across the mountains. But he knew one thing for certain: he hadn't found her by accident. Some things out here are meant to be. A storm, a stranger, a second chance. Elias Rowe turned from the window, poured another log onto the fire, and whispered to himself, "Guess we're not done being tested yet." Outside, the wind sighed against the cabin walls, carrying away the last of the storm, and inside, a flicker of life began to thaw what the cold had buried long ago. The morning after the blizzard rose pale and hollow. The world outside wrapped in silence thick as wool. The storm had spent itself during the night, leaving behind a white wilderness, quiet, endless, and dangerous still. Inside Elias Rowe's cabin, the fire burned low, throwing shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts that hadn't found rest. He sat in his chair, boots by the hearth, watching the woman he'd pulled from the snow. She stirred beneath the blankets, her lips trembling as she woke. When her eyes opened, they darted around the room, wild, unfocused. Frightened, he spoke softly, his voice low and rough, like boots on gravel. "You're safe. You're at my place, near Hollow Creek. You were near gone when I found you." The woman blinked, tried to sit up. Her breath hitched when she saw him this tall. Weathered man with the look of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. Her name came out like a secret escaping. "Margaret. Margaret Hale." She said it as if it might change tomorrow, like names were something the world could take from you if you weren't careful. Elias nodded once. Slow. "Elias Rowe. Those are my children. Ben and Clara. You've been here a night." The girl peeked from the loft above, small fingers gripping the rail. "Hi, Miss Margaret," she said softly. Margaret blinked up at her, startled, then managed a faint smile. "Hello there." Elias poured water into a tin cup, handed it over. "You need rest. The worst of the storms passed, but roads are gone. You'll be here a while." Margaret's eyes went to the window, to the world of white waiting beyond the glass. Her voice came thin, strained. "No, I can't stay. You don't understand. It's not the storm I'm running from." Elias studied her quietly, the way a man studies a wounded animal that might bolt if he moves too fast. He said, "Steady as a fence post. Then whoever's chasing you will have to face me first." She looked at him then, really looked at him, this stranger who spoke like law written on rough wood. And for a moment, she didn't argue. She just nodded, the smallest surrender, and wrapped the blanket tighter. The days that followed were slow and fragile. The wind still roamed the hills outside, and drifts of snow pressed high against the cabin walls. Inside, life tried to thaw. Margaret couldn't stay still. She moved carefully through the room, still weak but restless. She mended a torn sleeve, patched a pair of mittens, set things straight on the shelf, as if by keeping her hands busy she could keep her heart from breaking. Clara followed her everywhere, bright-eyed, asking questions that would have worn a saint thin. Ben watched from a distance, suspicious at first, the way boys are when strangers come near their small, protected world. But he softened when she taught Clara a song, an old tune about spring and wildflowers. Her voice was clear but cracked around the edges, like something once whole, now mended with care. Elias listened in silence from his chair. Something inside him, something long dormant, stirred again. Not love, not yet, but the echo of it, The memory of what it felt like to have another presence in the room besides duty and grief. He told himself it was pity, that he was just being kind. But every time she smiled faintly at the children, every time she moved through the cabin's small light, he felt the weight in his chest shift just enough to notice. That night, long after the children had gone to bed, Elias sat at the table carving a small horse out of pine. The woman watched from the firelight, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea Clara had insisted she take. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just old and familiar, like the land outside. Finally, she spoke. "Do you ever wonder why some storms find us?" He didn't look up. "Storms find everyone sooner or later." She nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the flames. "I suppose so." The fire popped, a log shifting. Her voice dropped low, almost to herself. "I wasn't meant to be out there. You know, not like that. I was supposed to be in a church, standing beside a man I didn't love." Elias stopped carving. He didn't say anything. He just waited the way men of few words often do, giving silence the room to pull truth to the surface. Margaret took a breath, steadying herself against the telling. "His name is Silas Greer. You've likely heard of him." Elias's eyes flicked up, and the look said he had. Everyone in 3 counties had. Greer owned half the land and treated most of the people like the other half. She went on, the word slow, deliberate, as if she had to drag them out. "I grew up in St. Tine, Louis. My father died owing Greer money, the kind of debt that never disappears. When I turned 30, he sent word, said I could clear the balance if I became his wife." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "He called it a kindness. Said he'd give me a fine home, protection. But it wasn't a marriage, it was a transaction." Elias's jaw flexed, muscles ticking under the beard. "Did you say no?" "I tried," she whispered. "He doesn't take no." He had a contract drawn, a pastor ready. "I didn't even know I'd signed until it was done. The ink was still wet when I realized I'd been bought." Her voice broke on the word bought. "I ran," she said, before the vows were finished. Still in the dress, stole his horse, rode blind into the storm. I figured I'd rather freeze free than live owned." The fire hissed as if in answer. Elias leaned back, staring at her across the dim room. He saw the bruises that fear left, the kind that don't show on the skin. He saw courage too, the quiet kind that keeps breathing when it would be easier not to. "Finally," he said softly, "no woman belongs to a man that way. Not out here, not anywhere." The words came out like scripture, plain and solid, hammered by truth. For a while, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind moaned low through the trees, and the firelight made the cabin walls look like the inside of a memory, warm in color but cold in feel. Then Clara's small voice came from the loft above. "Papa, you still awake?" Elias turned, gentled his tone. "Go back to sleep, little one." But she didn't. "Can Miss Margaret stay just till the snow melts?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard. Elias met her gaze, and in that moment, the decision was already made. Though neither said it aloud, Clara's voice drifted again, drowsy now. "She sings nice." Elias smiled faintly, something rare and rusty on his face. When he looked back at Margaret, she had tears in her eyes, but not from fear this time. Over the next days, time settled into a fragile rhythm. Margaret helped with the chores as best she could, folding blankets, mending, cooking simple meals that reminded Elias of what peace used to smell like. She told the children small stories about the city streetcars, music, lamps that never went out. To Clara, it sounded like magic. To Elias, it sounded like another world entirely. And sometimes, when the chores were done and the fire burned low, he'd catch her staring into the flames. Lost in thought, he didn't ask what she saw there. A man doesn't pry into another person's ghosts. But he knew she had them. Same as him. The two of them moved around each other carefully, like survivors who'd both been burned and weren't sure yet if the warmth they felt was safety or danger. Late one night, when the children were asleep and the storm outside had softened to a sigh, Margaret sat near the hearth sewing a tear in Ben's coat. Elias stood by the window, looking out into the dark. After a long while, she said quietly, "You saved me." He didn't turn. "You'd have done the same." "I don't think I would have." She said, "Not anymore." I was ready to stop running. He looked at her then, firelight catching the edges of her face. And something like understanding passed between them. "Grief," he said after a moment, "turns the heart to stone. But sometimes, even stone remembers what it's like to feel the sun." Margaret met his eyes. And for the first time since he found her, she smiled a real smile. Small but alive. And right then, the cabin didn't feel haunted anymore. Not by the past, not by sorrow, just by the fragile, flickering light of something trying to be born again outside. The moon rose pale over a valley wrapped in snow. The world was still, holding its breath. Inside that cabin, two broken souls began to thaw slowly, quietly, but surely, as if spring had decided to start early. In the heart of winter, spring doesn't come all at once in Montana. It creeps in like a shy stranger, one drip of meltwater at a time, turning the white world gray before it dares to turn it green. The snow around Hollow Creek had begun to loosen its grip. Creeks whispered again. Fence posts reappeared. And the air smelled faintly of mud and thawing pine. Inside the row cabin, life had found a fragile rhythm, 3 meals a day. Children's laughter returning. And a woman's voice humming through the rooms like sunlight, sneaking past old curtains. When the road finally cleared enough for travel, Elias hitched Juniper and saddled up for town. He needed flour, seed, salt, and he needed to face the world again. Margaret insisted on coming. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I can't hide forever." Elias. He tried to argue, then stopped. Hiding was no way to live. If the storm hadn't claimed her, shame wouldn't either. So he nodded. "All right then, we ride together." Hollow Creek sat 12 miles south. A single street of false front buildings that leaned against the wind like old men at a bar. There was a church with a white steeple pointing at heaven like an accusation. A general store, a blacksmith, and half a dozen houses strung along the road like teeth in a crooked smile. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone and everyone's business. As they rode in, heads turned. Conversations slowed, then stopped altogether. By the time Elias helped Margaret down from the saddle, the whispers had already started. Living in sin. Poor widowers lost his mind. Children, they'll grow up cursed. You mark my words. The words floated on the spring air. Light as feathers, sharp as knives. Margaret's hands trembled, but she kept her chin high. Elias walked beside her, yaw set, eyes forward. He'd faced grizzlies, blizzards, and loneliness. Gossip was just another kind of storm. Inside the general store, the warmth was worse than the cold. Every glance turned to a judgment. Mrs. Talbot, the shopkeeper's wife, stopped talking mid-sentence when she saw them. Her voice carried clear across the room. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Rowe, bringing his house guest." The pause hung heavy as wet laundry. Some people can't live decent even after the Lord gives them a second chance. Elias ignored her. He gathered flour, salt, nails, hands steady, eyes unflinching, but Margaret could feel every stare pressing against her back like stones. At the counter, Mrs. Talbot leaned forward. "Don't you think it's shameful? Elias, bringing temptation under your roof, with them children watching." He looked at her calmly. "Ma'am," he said, "temptation's something a man carries inside him. The rest is just weather." He paid, took the sack, and walked out before she could answer. Outside, Reverend Cole was waiting on the boardwalk. A tall man in a long black coat, eyes pale as washed-out sky. He offered a tight smile. "Brother Rowe," he said, "I'd hoped to speak with you." Elias stopped, already knowing what was coming. "The Lord tests us all." The Reverend continued, "I fear you're walking a dangerous road. Harboring a fallen woman brings risk to your soul and your children's." Elias met his gaze. Quiet, but unyielding. "She's not fallen, Reverend. She's trying to stand. The difference ought to matter." Cole sighed the way only pious men can sigh. "You can't fight the will of God." Elias's eyes hardened. "Out here, Reverend, God expects a man to do his own fighting." He turned to leave, and that's when the sound came, the heavy clop of horses, the jingle of polished harness, the hush that falls when fear walks into town wearing fine clothes. Silas Greer had arrived. He rode a black stallion, flanked by 3 men who looked carved out of granite. Greer himself was handsome in the way venom can be, beautiful, clean-shaven, tailored coat, silver spurs that caught the light. He dismounted slow, smiling the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Mr. Rowe," he called, voice smooth as whiskey and twice as dangerous. "I hear you've got something that belongs to me." Margaret froze beside Elias. Her breath hitched. Her hands clutched the reins until her knuckles turned white. Elias stepped forward, blocking Greer's path. "She doesn't belong to anyone." Greer laughed softly, the sound like glass breaking underfoot. Brave words from a farmer. But the law disagrees. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Crisp and official. A signed contract of marriage. Witnessed and sealed. "This woman is my legal wife, and your keeping her constitutes theft." The sheriff, thin, nervous, already sweating, walked out of the saloon just in time to nod. "Contract's binding. Elias, you'd best hand her over." Elias's voice dropped to something cold enough to burn. "You calling a woman property now?" "Sheriff," the man looked away. "It's the law." "Then maybe the law's broke." Greer's smile never faltered. "I'll give you 3 days to think it over. Return her, and I'll forget this insult. Refuse, and I'll take your land as compensation." The deed's already on file with the county judge. He tipped his hat toward Margaret. Mock polite. "See you soon." "My dear, try not to wander off this time." Then he mounted up and rode off, his men behind him. Dust rising from the thawing street, the town exhaled all at once. The way people do when danger passes but shame stays behind. Not one person met Elias's eyes. They rode home in silence. The trail was soft with mud, the sky gray and heavy again, as if even the weather couldn't bear what had just happened. When they reached the cabin, Ben ran to help with the horses. Clara chattered about the seeds she wanted to plant. They didn't know the world had just tilted under their feet. Inside, Margaret moved like a ghost, quiet, efficient, distant. She made supper, ate little, said less. Elias tried to speak, but his words kept catching in his throat. When the children went to bed, she stood by the fire, staring into the flames. Her voice, when it came, was brittle as ice. He's not bluffing. He'll take everything you have. Elias stepped closer. I won't let him. She turned, eyes bright with unshed tears. You don't understand what men like him can do. He owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. He owns fear. Elias shook his head. No man owns what's right. He'll ruin you. She whispered. Your land, your children, everything. He took a breath. The kind that feels like it costs something. My children already lost one mother. Don't make them lose hope, too. That cracked her composure clean in half. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She shook her head. If I stay, he'll destroy you. I can't be the reason your children lose their home. He reached for her hand. She pulled away. Please, he said, voice breaking. Don't go. But she was already walking toward the small room where her borrowed things lay folded. Later that night, long after the fire burned low, Elias woke to silence that felt wrong. The cabin was too still, too empty. He rose, saw the door cracked open, snow melting in the threshold. On the table lay a folded note. He opened it, and the words cut like wind through wet clothes. Better the storm than what follows it. He sank into the chair, letter trembling in his hands. For a long time, he just sat there, listening to the quiet, to the faint creak of the rafters, to the ghosts of laughter that had filled this place only days before. Outside, the moon hung cold and thin over the valley. Somewhere beyond those hills, a woman rode alone into the dark again, chasing freedom she might never catch. Elias bowed his head. He'd faced death before. But loss was the one storm a man never learns to ride through. The children woke before dawn and found him still at the table. The note beside the lamp. Clara climbed into his lap, sleepy and small. Papa, where's Miss Margaret? He swallowed hard. She had to go. Sweetheart. Why? He looked at the door, the world beyond it, gray with mourning. Because some folks forget their souls trying to keep their power. The girl frowned, not understanding, then wrapped her arms around his neck. He held her close, eyes burning with the kind of tears men hide from children. Outside, the first light touched the snowmelt, turning it to mirrors that reflected everything and forgave nothing. Somewhere far off, hoofbeats echoed faintly against the mountains. The thaw had come, but warmth was still a long way off. And in the quiet of that new morning, Elias Rowe understood some storms don't come from the sky. They ride on horseback, wearing fine clothes, carrying papers that pretend to be truth. And when they pass through a town like Hollow Creek, good men have to decide whether they'll bow to the law or stand for what's right. Night settled heavy over Hollow Creek, the kind of night that tests a man's faith, or shows him he never had much to begin with. Elias Rowe sat alone by the dying fire, Margaret's note open on the table beside him. Outside, wind pressed against the cabin walls, low and restless. Inside, grief hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. He'd buried his wife years ago, but this was different. Death you can make peace with. Leaving, leaving cuts a man open in ways no grave ever could. He stared at the letter until the words blurred. Then, for the first time in 4 years, Elias bowed his head. His prayer came halting, rusty from disuse. God, I ain't been on speaking terms with you since Sarah died. I don't even know if you listen anymore. But if you do, if you still see men like me, help me find her. Or help her find peace. Either one'll do. The wind howled back through the chimney, and the only answer was silence. But sometimes, silence is just God's way of saying, keep moving. Hours later, hoofbeats broke the quiet. Lantern light flickered through the window. Elias opened the door to find Mary and Jed Carter on the porch, breathless from the ride. They were older now, neighbors from the far ridge. Folks who still believed a person's word was worth more than his wealth. Mary didn't waste a second. I found something, she said, thrusting a stack of papers into Elias's hands. He scanned them: signatures, stamps, names he recognized, and some he didn't. Jed spoke in that slow, certain way of his. Silas Greer's contract? It's a lie. Witness was dead before the ink dried. Seal belongs to another county. Mary talked to 2 women Greer did the same to. Promised marriage. Called it debt. Same story. Different faces. Elias felt something shift inside him, not quite hope. Not yet. But the shadow of it. Then it's not binding, he said quietly. Mary nodded. Not legally. But he'll fight it. You'll need to prove it before the town, the same people who already judged her. Elias looked at the fire, the papers trembling slightly in his hands. He could almost hear Greer's voice again. Slick and certain. You've got 3 days. Tomorrow made 3. Jed laid a hand on his shoulder. When the night's darkest, Elias, that's when you find out what kind of man you are. And who's going to stand in the dawn with you? Elias breathed deep, nodded once. Then we ride at dawn. He didn't sleep, just sat there, watching the embers fade and return with each gust of wind. Around midnight, the door creaked open. Margaret stood there, wrapped in a borrowed coat, snow in her hair, eyes rimmed red from tears and wind. She looked like she'd been running all night, and maybe she had. I couldn't leave, she said simply. Elias rose, every word caught behind his ribs. She laid her trembling hand on the papers. What is this? Proof, he said. Proof that man forged everything that binds you. Her breath hitched. Then I'm free, he shook his head. Not yet. But by tomorrow, you will be. We'll make the town see truth, even if we have to hammer it into their thick skulls ourselves. Margaret looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, she didn't see a farmer. She saw the kind of man the frontier was supposed to make, one who stood when everyone else turned away. Morning came pale and cold. The kind of light that feels like a beginning, whether you're ready or not. The frost on the ground glittered like shattered glass. Elias saddled Juniper. Ben and Clara bundled in blankets on the wagon seat. Eyes wide with that mix of fear and faith children carry better than grown-ups. Margaret climbed up beside them, her hands shaking but steadying, when Elias reached over and covered them with his own. Mary and Jed rode ahead, the papers tucked safe in a leather satchel. As they set off toward Hollow Creek, the world around them still half winter, half spring, Elias spoke softly, mostly to himself. Justice out here ain't a thing you find in books. It's a thing you build nail by nail, with whatever truth you can hold steady in your hands. The road wound narrow through the trees, frost crunching beneath the horses' hooves. Each mile felt heavier than the one before. The weight of what waited in that town, pressing on all of them. But there was something else too, something steady and strong beneath the fear. Hope, the kind that doesn't shout or promise miracles, but whispers quietly. Stand your ground. By the time they saw the first rooftops of Hollow Creek, the sun had climbed over the ridgeline, spreading light across the valley. The church steeple caught the dawn like a sword raised to heaven. Elias couldn't help but think, maybe, just maybe, this town was about to see what its name really meant, redemption. He turned to Margaret, her face pale but resolute. Whatever happens, he said, you're not facing it alone. She gave a small nod, voice low. And whatever happens, Elias, don't let them break what you've rebuilt. He almost smiled. Tried that once. Didn't take. They rode the last mile in silence. Every hoofbeat sounded like a promise being kept. Elias Rowe had prayed for the first time in years. Now, he was about to find out if God had been listening, and somewhere in the wind, carrying over the thawing hills, came the faintest whisper of church bells, not a warning this time, but a summons. By noon, the town square of Hollow Creek was packed tight enough to choke the wind. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Elias Rowe was riding in with that runaway woman, and a stack of papers said to make fools out of the mighty. The church bell tolled slow, heavy, as if even God was waiting to see which way the scales would tip. Elias rode at the front, children bundled in the wagon, Margaret beside him, pale but unflinching. Behind them came Mary and Jed Carter, steady as truth itself. The crowd parted, whispers rising like smoke. Silas Greer stood on the church steps, dressed in his finest, confidence shining like oil on water. 3 ranch hands flanked him, and the sheriff nervous, sweating, hovered at his side. Greer raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. Let's not draw this out, he said smoothly. This woman is my wife. She ran from her vows, stole my property, and now hides behind a grieving fool who's forgotten his place. He turned his eyes on Margaret, his smile thin and venomous. You were born to serve. My dear, you'll come home now. Margaret said nothing, but her hands clenched tight. Elias stepped forward, voice steady but ringing with something fierce. You call her fallen, he said, each word cutting through the cold air. I call her brave. She ran from chains most of you pretend not to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He didn't stop. She came to my door half dead. She brought life back into my home, laughter back into my children. She made me remember what faith felt like after I'd buried mine with my wife. If that's sin, then maybe this town's been worshiping the wrong God. Silence fell, the kind that weighs more than any sound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Greer's smile cracked. Touching, he sneered. But words don't change law. He waved the paper in his hand. Her signature, witnessed and sealed. Mary Carter stepped forward, holding her satchel close. Then let's talk about that seal. Her voice, though gentle, carried clean across the square. She laid out the proof names, dates, a witness dead months before the signing, a magistrate's mark stolen from another county, the testimonies of 2 other women Greer had trapped in the same way. The sheriff took the papers, his hands shaking. He looked them over. eyes darting between the lines, between the truth and the man he'd been serving. Finally, something inside him broke free. He turned to Greer. "This here's forgery. And you put your hands on her that day in the store that's assault." He reached for his cuffs. "You're under arrest." Greer laughed, sharp and ugly. "You think you can touch me? I own this town." But no one moved to help him. Not one man. Not one woman. People who'd looked away for years now stepped back, faces hard with shame. The ranch hands who'd ridden in with him dropped their eyes and melted into the crowd. For the first time, Silas Greer looked small, a king without a kingdom, stripped bare in front of the people he'd ruled by fear. The sheriff locked the cuffs with a click that sounded like thunder, and the crowd, silent until now, let out a breath that felt like redemption. Elias turned to Margaret. The weight of it all, the fight, the fear, the long road to this square fell away in that single moment. He went to one knee in the dust before her, voice trembling not from weakness, but from everything he still dared to hope for. "Not because you need saving," he said softly, "but because I do. Will you marry me? Margaret Hale, of your own choosing, your own will." For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then tears filled her eyes, and she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "I choose you. I choose this life." The Reverend, pale, shaking, stepped forward from the crowd. "Then by the grace of God," he said, voice unsteady, "let's see it done proper." Elias stood, took Margaret's hands in his. The townsfolk gathered closer. Faces softened now, some smiling through tears, some bowing their heads. And there, in the same square that had once judged her, they watched a new covenant, made not bound by fear or law, but by love freely given. The sheriff removed his hat. The crowd bowed their heads. And for the first time in years, the people of Hollow Creek felt what grace truly meant. The town that had forgotten its soul found it again that day, not in sermons, not in laws, but in the sight of two broken hearts choosing to build something whole. 3 months passed, and the valley had traded snow for sunlight. The row cabin stood taller now, an extra room added. A new porch, built by steady hands and a patient heart. Where frost once ruled, wildflowers spread like forgiveness. A garden bloomed. Green and stubborn, Margaret Rowe knelt in the soil, sleeves rolled up, planting beans in neat rows. Elias worked beside her, sweat on his brow, peace in his eyes. She smiled faintly. "You think they'll grow?" He looked up, brushed dirt from his hands. "With you tending them, no doubt." From the yard came laughter, Clara chasing butterflies, Ben carving a toy horse for the baby brother or sister soon to come. For the first time in years, the air around that cabin sounded like home. Then Clara called out, voice bright and clear, "Papa, tell us again how you found Mama." Elias laughed. That deep, rare sound that only comes from a healed heart. She wasn't lost, he said, glancing toward Margaret. Not really. She was just waiting for the storm to clear. They stood together as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and rose. The wind was gentle now, carrying the scent of lilac and rain, the promise of summer hanging thick in the air. The blizzard nearly killed them both. But mercy comes in strange shapes, sometimes a storm, sometimes a stranger. Out here, you don't find peace. You build it, one hard-won day at a time. And friends, if this story stirred something in you, tell me what you felt down in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of courage, love, and the wild heart of the American West. This is Western Tales. Until next time, ride steady and keep the fire burning.